Picture this. You are standing in a dry valley. Dust is settling over your boots. On one hillside, thousands of soldiers, bronze armor catching the early light. On the other, another army, just as large, just as quiet. And between them, nothing but silence. The kind of silence that arrives when something impossible is about to step into the world. Then the ground moves. Not from horses, not from thunder. From one set of footsteps. Oh, the shape that walks into the open is not what any history book prepared you for. It is taller than any man alive, broader than anything that should exist. And it has been walking this earth for a reason no classroom ever fully explained. The name given to this being was Goliath. But that name is the smallest part of the truth. For thousands of years, the story of Goliath was simple. He was a warrior, a champion from the Philistine city of Gath, a large, powerful, armored man who stepped into the valley of Elah and made a single demand: send your best soldier and let one fight settle it all. Winner takes the war, and for 40 straight days, not one Israelite accepted. Not one. That silence tells you something. These were not farmers pressed into service. These were trained soldiers, veterans of real combat, men who had seen iron and blood and did not scare easily. And yet, every single one of them stood still. According to the biblical text, Goliath stood 6 cubits and a span tall. A standard biblical cubit is 18 inches. A span is 9. Do the calculation. 6 cubits and a span places Goliath at 9 feet and 9 inches. Close to 10 feet of armored warrior standing in the valley floor, waiting. He wore a coat of bronze mail weighing 5,000 shekels, roughly 125 pounds of armor just on his chest. The iron tip of his spear alone weighed 600 shekels, about 15 pounds. Just the tip. Thus, his shield-bearer walked ahead of him, simply to carry what he needed to cross a field. The story most of us were taught ends with a shepherd boy named David. He came down the hillside with no armor, no sword, and 5 smooth stones from the stream. One stone found the gap between the helmet and chest plate, a small opening above the bridge of Goliath's nose. Goliath fell. The Philistine army turned and ran. And David became the most celebrated figure in ancient military history. And the lesson was clean and timeless. Courage over size, faith over force. The small can bring down the great. For centuries, that lesson was the whole story. Scholars analyzed it. Children were taught it. Theologians built entire systems of meaning around it. The name Goliath entered every language on earth as a word for something too enormous to defeat. And that is exactly where most people stop. They receive the lesson, they carry it forward, and they never ask the deeper questions underneath it. They never ask what Goliath actually was. They never ask where something that size came from, or why the ancient world was not more surprised by it. They never ask why the very same Bible that records Goliath's death also records, in multiple separate locations, entire groups of beings that shared his bloodline. Being so far outside the normal range of human biology that the ancient scribes had a specific word reserved for them alone. That word was Nephilim. And once you understand what that word actually means, what the oldest texts on earth say about where these beings came from and what they were doing here, the story of David and Goliath changes entirely. It stops being a story about courage. It becomes something far older, far stranger, and far harder to explain. Something the official record has kept quietly in the footnotes for a very long time. But what if the footnotes were always the most important part of the page? The crack in the official story does not begin with Goliath. It begins several centuries before his birth. in a passage so brief and so strange that most readers move past it without stopping. But once you stop and actually read it, you cannot unread it. The Book of Genesis, chapter 6, verse 4. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came in to the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. Those were the mighty men who were of old, men of renown. Mainstream scholarship treats this passage as metaphor, as ancient poetry, as a borrowed device from neighboring mythologies, inserted to explain why the early world was populated with legendary heroes. The official position is that it should not be read as a literal biological account. And for a long time, that position satisfied most people. But here is what that explanation does not address. The word Nephilim does not mean giant in Hebrew. It comes from the root verb naphal, meaning to fall, to be cast down. Ancient rabbinical scholars, the earliest interpreters of the text, consistently translated Nephilim not as giants, but as the fallen ones. Not large men, not symbolic heroes, fallen ones. A name that implies a descent from somewhere else, which raises one immediate and deeply uncomfortable question. Fallen from where? And more importantly, why do the exact same beings appear in ancient texts that have no connection to the Bible at all? The Sumerian clay tablets, among the oldest written records ever discovered on this earth, describe a category of beings called the Anunnaki. These were not fully human and not fully divine. They were described as enormous in stature. They possessed knowledge that no purely human civilization at that developmental stage should have had access to, as the Babylonian texts expand on the same accounts. The Akkadian records carry them further. The Egyptian tradition echoes the same idea in entirely different language. What you are looking at is not one mythology repeating itself across borders. You are looking at multiple independent ancient civilizations, separated by geography, language, and centuries, all arriving at the same description of the same category of being. That is not coincidence, that is a pattern. And patterns in the ancient record demand explanation. Then, in 1947, something was discovered in a set of limestone caves on the northwest shore of the Dead Sea that made this pattern impossible to set aside any longer. The Dead Sea Scrolls. Among the hundreds of fragmented manuscripts pulled from the caves at Qumran was a document scholars now refer to as the Book of Giants. Unlike the careful, edited prose of the canonical Bible, this text does not step around the Nephilim. It names them directly. It describes their physical appearance, their overwhelming size, their hybrid nature, their growing conflict with both human civilization and with the divine force that had placed them here. The text was held back from public access for decades after its authentication. Not because it was fraudulent. It was verified. But because what it described did not fit the framework of who we believed was walking the ancient world. Goliath, according to the genealogical records inside the Book of Samuel, was a descendant of Rapha, the founding figure of a lineage the ancient texts called the Rephaim. This was not a single family. It was a category of being, referenced across multiple Old Testament books, with their own territories, their own cities, and their own history stretching back long before the Israelite arrival in Canaan. They were not being conquered. They were being hunted, specifically, deliberately, by warriors assigned to a single task: find and eliminate the last of this bloodline. Goliath was not a large man who happened to be born in Gath. He was the last surviving member of something that should not have still been alive in 1000 BC. And when David's stone struck him down, it may not have been a military victory at all. It may have been the closing of a chapter that began before the flood itself. 6. Evidence pillars, Pillar 1. The measurement problem. Let us start with what the ancient record actually says about Goliath's body, because the numbers themselves open a door that the official explanation cannot fully close. The Masoretic Hebrew text of 1 Samuel, the version most modern Bibles are translated from, records Goliath's height as 6 cubits and a span. A standard biblical cubit is 18 inches. A span is 9. 6 cubits and a span equals 108 inches. Ante plus 9. That is 9 feet 9 inches, nearly 10 feet of armored warrior standing in the valley. That is not an athlete. That is not a tall man. That is something operating outside the biological parameters of the human species as we currently understand it. But here's where the record fractures. When scholars examined the Dead Sea Scroll fragments of the same passage, manuscripts that predate the Masoretic text by over 1,000 years, a completely different number appeared. As the Septuagint, the ancient Greek translation of the Old Testament compiled around 250 BC, also carries the same variant. Both record Goliath's height not as 6 cubits and a span, but as 4 cubits and a span. 4 cubits and a span equals approximately 6 feet 9 inches. 2 separate manuscript traditions, 2 completely different heights, one nearly double the other. The mainstream explanation is that later scribes inflated the number for dramatic effect, and the lower figure is more historically accurate. That is a reasonable position. But it does not account for the surrounding data. The weight of Goliath's armor, 125 pounds of bronze mail, is consistent across both manuscript traditions. The spear tip weight is identical in both versions. The accounts of his brothers and kinsmen, described in 2 Samuel as giants of comparable stature, do not change between the 2 versions. If the number was inflated for drama, then only the number was inflated, which is a strange and specific kind of editing. And even at the conservative figure of 6 feet 9, the question does not go away. The average male height in the ancient Near East was approximately 5 feet 4. 6 feet 9 in that context was not just tall, it was categorically different. A man of that size, surrounded by populations averaging 8 inches shorter, would have been remarkable enough to generate exactly the kind of multi-generational military response the Bible documents. Think about what that actually means. Even the most conservative reading of the evidence still places Goliath outside the normal range. The only debate is how far outside. Pillar 2. The Book of Enoch and the Watchers. To understand where Goliath came from, you have to go back to a text that was deliberately removed from the official biblical canon. A text so ancient that the New Testament book of Jude quotes it directly, without citation, as if every reader already knew it. A text that the Ethiopian Orthodox Church never stopped treating as sacred scripture. A text that disappeared from the Western world for over 1,000 years, until a Scottish explorer named James Bruce returned from Ethiopia in 1773, carrying 3 handwritten copies. The Book of Enoch. In its earliest chapters, the Book of Enoch names a specific class of beings called the Watchers. Their assignment was to observe humanity, not to interact, not to intervene, to watch from a distance as the human experiment unfolded. But according to the text, 200 of these watchers made a decision. They gathered on the summit of Mount Hermon, a specific named mountain, still visible on a modern map at the border of present-day Syria and Lebanon, and they made a collective agreement to descend and take human wives. The children born from those unions were the Nephilim. The Book of Enoch does not leave this abstract. It describes these offspring with physical specificity. Their size was extraordinary. Some manuscript versions record figures of 300 cubits, which, whether literal or symbolic, conveys an idea of scale that the human frame cannot contain. Their appetite was described as impossible to satisfy. Agriculture could not feed them. They consumed what the land produced, and then consumed the land. Eventually, according to the text, they turned on humanity itself. The divine response to their existence is described as one of the primary reasons the flood of Genesis was initiated. Not to punish human wickedness alone, but to remove from the earth something that should not have been born into it. The Watchers also transferred knowledge. The Book of Enoch is explicit about this. They taught metallurgy, the working of metals into weapons. They taught the reading of roots and herbs for enchantment. They taught astrology, celestial navigation, the arts of war. This knowledge was not given as a gift. It was, according to the text, a contamination, a disruption of the natural pace of human development, like uploading advanced software into a system that was never designed to run it. And here is the detail the mainstream record quietly avoids. Mount Hermon, the named landing site of the Watchers in the Book of Enoch, sits at the precise intersection of 33 degrees north latitude and 33 degrees east longitude. The same numerical pairing appears repeatedly at significant ancient sites across the globe. Whether that is a deliberate pattern or mathematical coincidence, no institution with authority has been willing to say definitively, "You don't think that is a coincidence, do you?" Pillar 3. The Anakim, the Rephaim, and the Imim. The beings described in Genesis chapter 6 were not a single incident. They were a bloodline. And that bloodline expanded. The Old Testament names at least 3 distinct populations of giant beings operating simultaneously in the ancient Near East. As the Anakim, whose Hebrew name connects to the concept of long-necked, or to a necklace-like physical feature, possibly referencing an elongated skull structure. The Rephaim, the direct lineage of Goliath, with their own named territories occupying large portions of what is now Jordan and the modern West Bank. And the Imim, named in Deuteronomy, with a word that translates, with striking directness, as the terrifying ones. These were not minor folk legends. They were documented military targets. The Israelite campaigns described across Joshua, Numbers, and Deuteronomy were not simply territorial conquests of neighboring peoples. Many of them were specifically and explicitly aimed at the elimination of these bloodlines from the land. When Joshua led the Israelite army into Canaan, the text states directly that removing the Anakim was a primary military objective. Caleb, one of Joshua's senior commanders, where he is honored in the text specifically for driving the Anakim out of the city of Hebron. The same Hebron that, centuries later, tradition identifies as the burial site of the patriarchs Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The patriarchs rested in a city the giants had claimed as their stronghold. Most people are never told this part. The Rephaim had an entire valley named after them, the Valley of Rephaim, referenced in both 2 Samuel and Joshua. Not a symbolic valley, a geographic location that bore the name of these beings because they had lived there in sufficient numbers to define the landscape around it. Goliath was not an unusual outlier among ordinary men. He was the territorial inheritor of an ancient lineage, standing in a valley his ancestors had named, fighting a war that began long before any of the political disputes between Israel and Philistia were even a memory. And that was only the beginning. Pillar 4. The bones in the ground. Here is where the story moves from ancient manuscript into physical evidence. Throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, reports of extraordinarily large skeletal remains appeared consistently from excavation sites across multiple continents. These were not fringe publications. They appeared in mainstream newspapers of their era, regional dailies, agricultural digests, and major city papers that are still archived and accessible today. And then, in almost every case, the reports simply stopped. The remains were transferred, reclassified, or quietly noted as missing from institutional records. In 1833, soldiers digging at Lompoc Rancho in California reported uncovering a skeleton estimated at 12 feet in length. It had a double row of teeth. It was surrounded by engraved stone weapons and large stone slabs carved with unidentified symbols. Local indigenous elders requested the remains be reburied immediately. They were. No formal catalog entry was ever recorded. In 1912, farmers excavating burial mounds near Lake Delavan in Wisconsin documented skeletal remains ranging from 7 to 9 feet in height. Elongated skulls, unusually dense bone structure. The discovery was covered by the local newspaper. Then coverage stopped. The remains were reportedly submitted to the Smithsonian Institution in Washington. They were never publicly cataloged. The Smithsonian appears in these accounts repeatedly. And while a widely circulated story, claiming the institution admitted to deliberately destroying giant remains, was later identified as satire, the pattern beneath that satire is real. Researchers formally requesting access to 19th and early 20th century skeletal submissions from the Smithsonian's own historical records consistently encounter the same response: incomplete documentation, misfiled entries, and remains cataloged as lost or unlocated. From an institution that maintains meticulous records of butterfly specimens from the same era, those gaps are, at minimum, worth questioning. Can this really be random? The most scientifically documented anomalous remains come from the Paracas region of Peru. The skulls recovered there are not the product of cultural cranial binding, a practice that does exist and that flattens the skull's shape without increasing its volume. The Paracas skulls are structurally different. Their total cranial capacity is up to 60% greater than a normal human skull. Their parietal plates, the bones that form the upper vault of the skull, are fused differently, forming a single plate where normal human anatomy produces two. This is not a deformity, it is an architectural difference, as if the skull was built on a different biological template from the beginning. In 2017, an independent DNA analysis conducted on Paracas skull tissue returned results that the researchers described as unlike anything currently in the genetic database. The mitochondrial DNA, the genetic material inherited through the maternal line, showed mutations matching no known human haplogroup from Europe, Asia, Africa, or the Americas. Mutations the researchers described as completely unknown in any human, primate, or animal known so far. That was only the beginning. But Pillar 5. The giants of every civilization. What makes the giant record impossible to dismiss as regional legend is its absolute universality. Every major ancient civilization on every inhabited continent preserved a tradition of an earlier race of beings of extraordinary physical size. The Norse tradition called them the Jotnar, not gods, not demons, but a third category of being, older than the gods themselves, whose world predated the world of men. The Greek accounts describe the Gigantes and the Titans as pre-human races who had ruled the earth before the age of Olympus. The Hindu Vedic texts contain detailed accounts of the Danavas and the Daityas, immense beings of cosmic power who predate the current human cycle entirely. The indigenous peoples of North America, from the Paiute tribe's oral histories of red-haired giants they called the Siteka, to the Cherokee accounts of a cannibalistic giant race called the Nunyunuwi, preserve physical descriptions with remarkable consistency across cultures that had no known contact with each other. The physical details repeat across all of them: extreme height, double rows of teeth, red or unusual hair color, 6 fingers on each hand, elongated skulls, strength beyond any human measure, a connection to the era before the Great Flood. These markers do not shift between cultures the way that artistic styles or religious metaphors shift. Yet they remain structurally identical across thousands of years and thousands of miles. As if every civilization was not inventing a legend. As if they were independently remembering the same type of being. And here is the connection that links it directly back to the valley where Goliath fell. 2 Samuel, chapter 21, records the deaths of 4 more giants in a series of battles following David's reign. One of them is described as having 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot, a specific biological anomaly called polydactyly, appearing here in a named biblical figure, and appearing in giant descriptions across Norse, Mesoamerican, and indigenous North American traditions as well. It is not artistic coincidence. It is a genetic signature, a marker that crossed oceans and survived in the oral memory of cultures that never shared a language. Think about what that actually means. So, Pillar 6, the Grasshopper Report. There is one final layer inside the biblical record that most readers walk past without registering its full weight. In Numbers, chapter 13, Moses sends 12 scouts into Canaan before the Israelite invasion. Their mission is straightforward: assess the land, the population, the fortifications, and the military reality. 10 of the 12 return with the same report. They saw the Enochim, and they describe the experience in language that stands alone in all of military history. We were like grasshoppers in our own sight, and so we were in their sight. This line is usually treated as fear-driven exaggeration, soldiers making the enemy larger than it was to justify their reluctance. But read it carefully again. In our own sight. These were experienced warriors, survivors of the Egyptian military campaign. Men who had spent 40 years in harsh wilderness conditions that would have ended the lives of anyone without genuine physical and psychological resilience. And the word they chose was not children, not small men, grasshoppers. The psychological impact of that report was so severe that it triggered a national crisis. An entire generation of Israelites was designated as unfit to enter Canaan, not as divine punishment, but because the people believed the scouts. Now they believed what their own trained soldiers had seen with their own eyes. And the military strategy of an entire ancient nation was restructured for 40 years as a direct consequence of the physical reality encountered in Canaan. That is not exaggeration. That is policy. Military policy, shaped by a physical encounter with something that fell outside every known category of enemy. And the policy continued. What follows in Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Chronicles reads less like territorial expansion and more like a systematic, generational eradication campaign, targeting a specific biological lineage across decades. By the time Goliath walks into the valley of Elah, the text implies that he is what remains. A last survivor. An outlier from a much larger population that has been methodically removed from the earth over generations. Standing alone in the morning. No army beside him. No city to return to. Now challenging an entire nation to send one man, because there is no longer a people of his own kind to stand with him. The last of something, waiting in the valley light, watching the answer that never came. Set the details aside for a moment. Step back from the manuscripts, the measurements, the bones, the DNA results, and ask the question that lives underneath all of them. What does it mean for all of us, if any part of this is real? If the Nephilim were not poetic metaphor? If the Watchers were not symbolic figures invented to explain human violence, if the giant bloodlines of the ancient Near East were a biological reality, documented in the ground and beginning to surface in genetic data, what does that do to the story humanity has been telling itself about what it is and where it came from? The official history of the human species is a story of linear progress. Primitive beginnings, gradual development. Stone tools became bronze tools, became iron. His scattered groups became cities, became kingdoms, became civilizations. It is a reassuring story. It places modern humanity at the peak of everything that came before. It makes our current moment feel like a destination, the natural endpoint of a long and continuous climb. But the ancient record, in culture after culture after culture, does not describe a climb. It describes a rupture. Something existed before us, or alongside us, that was different. Not a different nationality or a different language. Biologically different. Physically operating on a scale that early human civilization found incomprehensible. And at some point in the deep past, that something was removed. Systematically. Deliberately. Its physical evidence was buried. Its written records were excluded from the official canon, and the institutional memory that should have preserved its bones, as in case after documented case, produced only silence. Now, why would you erase something that was simply a large human? You would not. You erase something whose existence changes the meaning of everything else. And that brings us to the angle that does not live in excavation reports or ancient manuscripts. It lives inside you, right now. The human genome is the most complex information system ever studied. Scientists have spent decades mapping it and have still not fully accounted for all of it. Within the genome, a significant portion of DNA is classified as non-coding, sequences that do not appear to produce any known biological function. This material was once dismissed with the phrase, junk DNA. That phrase has been largely abandoned as science has come to understand that dismissing what you do not yet understand is not the same as understanding it. Some researchers, working at the outer edges of what the mainstream currently accepts, might have asked whether portions of that non-coding material represent inherited sequences from an ancient hybridization event, not between two modern human populations, between the human genome and something older. Something that left its signature inside us, the way a river leaves its shape in the land long after the water has moved on. We already know hybridization with non-modern humans happened. Now, modern humans carry 1 to 4% Neanderthal DNA, a fact that took decades to be accepted, but is now standard scientific teaching. We carry fragments of Denisovan DNA. We carry traces of a third archaic population whose physical remains have never been found, identified only by its genetic shadow inside populations living today. What if one of those shadows is older than any of them? What if the Nephilim did not disappear from the earth? Well, what if they simply dissolved into it, into us, leaving behind a genetic inheritance that no one has been brave enough to fully trace? This is not ancient history. This is your biology. The oldest layer of your story, written into you before any book was opened or any stone was cut. The sense that we are more than we have been told. That something enormous once walked this world beside us. And that there is a chapter of the human record that no authorized institution has been willing to open fully. That sense may not be spiritual intuition. It may be memory, encoded, waiting. Goliath fell in a valley between two armies. But what Goliath represented did not fall with him. It went somewhere. And the question of where, that question is still open. So, here is the question I leave with you. If Goliath was the last of the Nephilim bloodline, the final survivor of a race that once moved through this world on a scale we have not yet fully measured, then what exactly ended the moment that stone left David's hand? What civilization, what knowledge, what biological inheritance was already gone before Goliath ever stepped into the valley? And more quietly, what part of that inheritance might still be living inside you? Share your theory below. Were the Nephilim a biological reality? A spiritual one? Something in between? Were they something humanity was never meant to remember, or something we were never supposed to forget? The conversation in the comments on this channel is always one of the most extraordinary places on the internet. And I read far more of it than you think. If this story opened something in you, our video on the Book of Enoch and the Watchers goes deeper. into the names, the locations, the knowledge transferred, and what became of the ones who shared it. If this moved you, a thumbs up carries it to someone else who is ready to hear it. Keep your minds open, and until we meet again.